Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't wrap my head around what happened that day in Big Bend National Park, but I know I'll never forget it. My name is Mia Sanders. I'm 28, and in 2022, I went on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my boyfriend Lucas and our two friends, Jordan and Clara. We chose the Chisos Basin campground because it sounded remote and peaceful, like we could leave our real lives behind for a few days. I remember getting a weird feeling as soon as we arrived, though. The desert stretched for miles, and the silence felt oppressive instead of comforting, like something was watching us from behind the rocky hills. It all started early in the morning. We'd arrived late the night before and slept in our trailer, but I barely rested. There had been odd noises outside, scratching and soft tapping, like somebody lightly drumming on the metal. I couldn't get that sound out of my head, and I was already on edge when I woke up. I stepped out to find that some of our stuff was missing. A flashlight and a small bag of snacks had vanished. Jordan tried to laugh it off, saying maybe a raccoon broke in, but Clara looked uneasy. She'd read about weird disappearances in this region, stories that never got solved. She said there were rumors of forces out in the desert that made people lose their way or just vanish without a trace. Lucas shrugged it off. He was always the adventurous one and insisted we go on a hike to a nearby water source he'd read about. It wasn't super close to the campground, but he swore it'd be worth it. By late morning, the four of us were on the trail. The heat was brutal. Every step kicked up dust that stuck to my sweaty skin, and the path cut through harsh, rocky terrain that made my legs burn. I'll never forget how the landscape seemed both beautiful and suffocating at the same time. I loved hiking, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were out of our depth. Partway up, I thought I saw something move between the rock formations above us, like a tall, slender shape slipping behind a boulder. My heart jumped, but nobody else seemed to notice or care. Jordan joked it was probably a desert deer, or maybe a stray coyote. I tried to relax, but my nerves were shot. All I could think about was that weird scratching on the trailer last night and the missing items. I started wondering if we weren't alone out here. When we reached the water source, it was just a small, algae-coated pool trickling down from a rocky ledge. I was disappointed it wasn't more impressive, and Clara couldn't help bringing up the creepy stories again. She mentioned Nativo American legends about entities in the desert that lure travelers by mimicking familiar voices. I brushed it off, but even Lucas looked a bit uneasy when she said that. We refilled our water bottles in awkward silence and turned around to head back. That's when things got weird. We tried to follow the same path, but it felt like the environment had shifted. We recognized some rock landmarks, but somehow kept walking in circles. The heat was unbearable, and by early afternoon, I felt like my head was spinning. We wasted a lot of time scrambling over boulders that I didn't recall from before, and at one point, Clara tripped and twisted her ankle slightly. Nothing serious, but enough to slow us down. Eventually, we saw the roof of our trailer in the distance. It was almost evening by the time we dragged ourselves back to the campground. The sun was setting over the desert, and the sky was turning that hazy orange you only see in places like that. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just dead stillness. We decided to make something quick for dinner. Lucas fired up our small grill, while Clara went into the trailer to rest her ankle. Jordan and I collected some trash around the site, trying to clean up while there was still a bit of light. That's when I heard what sounded like my own voice calling from behind the trailer. It wasn't just a distant echo. It was my exact voice, calling my name. Mia. I froze, and I remember my heart dropping into my stomach. Jordan noticed the look on my face and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. I just stared at him. He must have seen how terrified I was because he stopped and looked around. The desert was empty. There wasn't anything behind the trailer except for some shrubs and the rocky slope leading to the basin. Jordan tried to laugh it off, suggesting maybe Clara or Lucas was messing with me. But I knew their voices, and this was definitely mine. I felt so unsettled that I rushed into the trailer, wanting to get away from whatever was out there. Inside, Clara was lying on her bunk, reading. She looked up at me with this worried expression as soon as she saw my face, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I heard. Lucas came in a moment later, complaining about how the grill's flame kept dying. He asked me to help him outside. I nearly refused, but I couldn't explain why, so I followed him out again. We cooked dinner quickly, not talking much. I could sense we were all spooked, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Nightfall came fast. The desert air cooled down, but the silence grew heavier. We decided to stay inside the trailer after we ate, thinking we'd just play some cards and go to bed early. Jordan closed the trailer door and locked it. We tried to distract ourselves, but every creak outside made us jump. At one point, Clara leaned forward and said she thought she heard something pacing around outside. Lucas flicked off the overhead light so we could peek out the window without drawing attention. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I stared out into the dark. The only thing I saw was the faint outline of the mountains against the night sky. About an hour later, I heard it again, my name, in my own voice, coming from somewhere in the desert. "Mia, come here." I almost dropped the deck of cards I was holding. This time, everyone heard it. Clara grabbed my arm so tight her nails dug into my skin. Lucas and Jordan both looked stunned. For a second, we thought maybe it was the wind or some bizarre echo, but it was too precise. It sounded close, like it was right outside. I don't know how long we sat there in silence, but eventually, Lucas gathered the nerve to open the door. He stepped out with a flashlight, and Jordan followed behind him. I stayed near the doorway, just in case they needed to jump back in. They walked around the trailer, shining the beam of light along the sides, checking the ground for footprints or something that might explain this. They didn't find anyone or anything. The dust outside was untouched. No footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. It was like that voice materialized out of thin air. I remember the flashlight flickering a bit, which only added to the tension. We all went back inside, and that's when we heard these faint scratches on the metal walls of the trailer, like something was dragging its fingernails across the surface. Jordan pressed his ear to the wall, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the noise would stop and start in different spots. It was almost playful, like it was testing how we'd react. Then a new sound joined in, tapping, but in a rhythm that weirdly matched my heartbeat. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. And then, out of nowhere, we heard Lucas's voice echo from outside. But Lucas was right there next to me. It called Jordan's name after that, and Clara's, in the exact tone we each used. It was like something had recorded every one of us and was playing us back. Clara began to cry, silently at first, and I remember feeling so helpless, like a trapped animal. We had no clue what was out there or why it wanted to toy with us like this. The tapping escalated into heavy thuds against the trailer, shaking the walls. It felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably just a minute or two. Lucas kept trying to call out, "Who's there?" but got no response. Only more of that mocking repetition of our voices. The worst part was hearing my own voice from outside, telling me to open the door. I almost felt hypnotized by it, like it was speaking directly into my mind. But I resisted the urge to look out again. Finally, everything just stopped. The tapping, the scratching, the voices, gone in an instant. The sudden silence was almost worse. We were petrified, waiting for something else to happen. We sat there, hearts pounding, too scared to speak above a whisper. Lucas mouthed that he thought it was over, but none of us believed him. We were afraid to move. The hours dragged by, and at some point we heard distant footsteps circling the trailer, like something was prowling around, trying not to be heard. I didn't realize I'd been holding Clara's hand until I felt her trembling. I couldn't even begin to calm her down because I was just as terrified. Jordan eventually grabbed the keys to our vehicle, and we decided we couldn't spend another second out there. We opened the trailer door at the first sign of dawn. The sky was still mostly dark, but faint sunlight was creeping over the horizon. Every single one of us stepped out like we were heading into a war zone. I half expected to see some bizarre creature waiting for us, but there was nothing, just the desert's eerie hush. That's when I noticed large claw marks on the side of the trailer. They were deep, and they cut through the paint in long, jagged lines. It made my stomach turn. We hadn't heard that noise earlier, or maybe we were too panicked to notice it happening. Whatever scratched the trailer left a permanent reminder of that night. We didn't bother packing everything neatly. Lucas basically threw our gear into the back of the vehicle, and Jordan helped him while Clara and I stood watch, scanning the area. I kept expecting to hear that voice again, calling for me in the exact tone I use. But it never came. By full sunrise we were speeding away, taking the same rough road out that we had come in on, not caring about the potholes or the rocks. I was so wound up I could barely speak. My head was pounding, and my hands kept shaking on my lap. That was the last time I ever camped in the desert. Even thinking about it now makes my skin crawl. We never got an explanation. We didn't report it. What would we have said? Hey, there's something out in Big Bend that mimics voices and scratches up trailers. No one would believe that. I'm not even sure I believe it myself sometimes. But those claw marks, the missing items, the voices, I can't deny they happened. Clara swears some ancient force roams out there, luring people into the wilderness. Lucas tries to rationalize it as some messed-up prank by other campers, though we never saw a single soul near us. Jordan just refuses to talk about it at all. Even now, I can't look at open desert the same way. Every time I see a vast stretch of land without anyone around, I feel that unease creeping up my spine. I still hear that voice in my nightmares sometimes, my own voice calling me to come closer. I don't know what we encountered out there, and maybe I never will, but I've come to accept that certain places hold secrets far older and stranger than we can imagine. Sometimes those secrets step out of the shadows just long enough to remind us that we're not in control at all. And just like that, it ended as quickly as it began, leaving me with a memory I wish I could forget. But I know I'll never be the same. We drove away, the desert eventually disappearing in the rearview mirror, and I've spent every day since wondering if that thing is still out there, calling someone else's name, waiting for another curious group to wander too far into its domain. Story 2. My name is Laura Weston. I'm 34 years old, and in 2019, I drove from Wellsboro all the way to the Sam Houston National Forest in Texas, hoping to find some peace after a messy divorce. I had this small trailer that I used as both my writing haven and my temporary home, and I chose the most secluded area I could find. I remember pulling in that morning and feeling this wave of relief. The towering pine trees blocked most of the sunlight, which created a kind of dim green glow all around me. It felt peaceful at first, like I was finally doing something good for myself. I spent the first half of the day setting up my trailer and exploring a little patch of the woods near my spot. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I was grateful for the solitude. I wrote a few pages, listened to the distant sound of birds, and just tried to clear my head. Everything felt normal until late afternoon, when I got this strange feeling, like a heaviness in the air. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the forest was watching. I convinced myself I was just jumpy because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. Then, right before dusk, I started hearing these odd giggles. They were very light and high-pitched, sounding a lot like children. At first, I assumed it could be some family camping nearby. But I swear, the laughter seemed to echo from behind the trees in every direction, even though I hadn't noticed any other vehicles or tents around. I tried shining my flashlight between the trunks, but everything beyond the first few rows of trees just looked like dark shapes. That sense of being watched only intensified. Eventually, it got dark, and the giggles would come and go, disappearing for a few minutes before starting up again. I felt this chill run down my spine every time I heard them. It wasn't a normal children's laugh. It had this creepy echo that just lingered. I got nervous enough to grab my keys, deciding I might just leave altogether if it got any weirder. But when I went to start the engine, the trailer didn't respond at all. The battery was fine, brand new in fact. No reason it shouldn't have worked. I checked the cables under the hood, looked at everything I could, but nothing made sense. It was like my trailer was simply refusing to start. While I was under the hood, a woman called out to me from a distance. She introduced herself as Maggie, maybe in her late 50s or early 60s. She said she lived in a small cabin somewhere off a hidden path. She had this concerned look on her face, like she knew something I didn't. She asked if I'd heard the voices. That's the word she used, voices. I kind of froze, but I nodded. Maggie handed me a small bundle of dried herbs and a twisted piece of metal shaped like a horseshoe. She told me, in a really hushed tone, that if those giggles came back, I should burn the herbs and keep the horseshoe near the door. I could see she was serious, and honestly, I was too scared to question her. As soon as she left, the laughter started again, even louder this time. It was all around, coming from the dark spaces in the forest. Then I heard a sudden thump against the side of my trailer, like someone was throwing rocks. My heart was racing. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door a crack, thinking maybe some animal was rummaging around. But then I saw these tiny footprints in the dirt. They looked like a child's footprints, but too small, almost like a toddler's size, and they were spaced in a way that just didn't look right. It was like they appeared out of nowhere and led straight to the trailer wall, where I'd heard the thump. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and stood there in the darkness, trying to calm myself down. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the herbs Maggie gave me. I could still hear that laughter drifting in and out, sometimes close, sometimes far. It was messing with my senses because it never felt like it was coming from just one place. I got this overwhelming sense that whatever was out there wasn't just playing around. It was trying to scare me, and it was working. I decided to do what Maggie said. I took a lighter and burned the edges of the dried herbs, walking around inside the trailer, letting the smoke fill every corner. It smelled strong, kind of earthy and sharp, and for a moment the laughter sounded like it was twisting into a shriek. I remember literally feeling my ears ring. It was almost as if the presence outside was furious at what I was doing. The trailer walls started to rattle, and I heard this scratching sound on the metal, like small fingernails scraping. In a burst of panic, I grabbed the horseshoe and held it tight, pacing from one end of the trailer to the other. I can't even describe the fear. It was like my entire body was telling me to run, but there was nowhere safe to go. Then, all at once, the noises stopped. The shaking, the scratching, all of it just ended in a snap. I could only hear my own breathing and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, wide awake, gripping that horseshoe. The forest was dead silent again. No giggles, no wind, no animals. By the time the first bit of sunlight started peeking through the windows, I forced myself to test the engine one more time. This time it started up without a single hiccup, as if the battery had never been drained. I took that as my one and only chance to get out of there. I packed up in record time, didn't even bother to eat or make coffee, and drove off as fast as I could down the narrow forest road. I still get chills whenever I think about it. No matter how many times I replay that night in my head, I can't find a logical explanation. Those footprints, the laughter, the sudden failure of my trailer, and then Maggie showing up with the exact thing I needed. It's all stuck in my memory, and sometimes I swear I can still hear faint giggling at the edge of my thoughts. If there was something in those woods, it let me go just as quickly as it found me, and I still don't know why. To this day, I haven't been back to that area. I might never go. Part of me feels like there are secrets in that forest that aren't meant to be disturbed, like it's alive in a way I've never felt anywhere else. I'm just grateful I made it out, even if a piece of that night followed me in my mind. I try not to dwell on it too much, but every now and then a random breeze or a certain smell will bring it all back, and I remember how close I felt to something truly terrifying that I still can't explain. And maybe I never will. Story 3. My name is Mark Hollis. I'm 42 years old, and at the end of 2021, I left my hometown of Chesterfield to spend a few days at the Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. I'd been feeling a heaviness in my life for a while, just a lot of dark thoughts weighing on me. So I decided to take my old trailer and park it near this huge limestone pit I'd heard about. It's over 120 meters deep and home to thousands of bats. I thought a few days alone, focusing on geology, an old hobby of mine, might clear my head. The sinkhole was even more intimidating in person than I'd imagined. It's basically this massive, gaping chasm in the ground, like a black hole in the middle of barren land. I noticed some warning signs around it, stuff like no entry or restricted area. But honestly, I figured that was just for liability reasons. I was mostly there to take photos and maybe get some drone shots, so I didn't think I'd be doing anything reckless. Right when I arrived, I set up my trailer about 50 yards from the edge. It was late afternoon and the sun was beating down pretty hard. Despite the heat, the place just felt off. There was almost no wind, and the few bird calls I heard seemed distant, like they were echoing in a cave. I powered up my drone, eager to capture some overhead footage of the sinkhole. But every time I tried to fly it near the lip of that massive pit, the drone lost signal, or the battery drained almost immediately, even though it was fully charged. I must have tried 3 or 4 times with different batteries, but every attempt failed the moment the drone approached that gaping hole. That night, things got weirder. It was super quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I was lying in my trailer, reading a geology magazine under a small lamp. Then, out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a deep, raspy voice calling my name. Mark. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I snapped upright, heart pounding. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. But I didn't see anyone, just the shadowy outline of the sinkhole and the dry Texas landscape lit by a pale moon. The silence around me felt almost suffocating. After a while, I convinced myself it was the wind or some echo off the rocks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I went for a short walk around the area, wanting to clear my head. That's when I spotted this old, tattered book, half buried in the dirt. The cover was torn, and the pages were yellowed. It had these strange symbols, spirals, shapes, and lines I couldn't make sense of. The text inside was in some unknown language. It gave me an immediate chill, like I was holding something I shouldn't be touching. But curiosity got the better of me. I brought it back to my trailer, thinking I might look it up online later. Throughout the day, I kept glancing at the pages, feeling almost drawn in. The symbols seemed to shift a little whenever I tried to focus on them, which made me nauseous. It was like an optical illusion, but it felt more sinister than a simple trick of the eye. I should have left the book where I found it, but something in me, maybe my own fascination with old artifacts, wouldn't let me. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, but couldn't relax. That oppressive silence had returned, thicker than before. As the sun set, I got that same uneasy sensation, like I was being watched. Then I heard it again. Mark. Except this time it sounded closer, like it was coming from right by the sinkhole's edge. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked toward the pit. There was this shape standing there, tall, impossibly tall, its eyes glowing the darkest red, like smoldering coals. It was just standing at the very rim. My flashlight flickered, and before I could register what I was seeing, I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. When I shone the light again, the figure was gone. I ran back to my trailer, slammed the door shut, and locked it, even though I was basically in the middle of nowhere. The air inside felt heavier, like I was breathing through a wet blanket. My overhead lamp started flickering, and the trailer walls cast these odd shadows that seemed to move on their own. I could hear faint scrapes against the outside panels, almost like claws dragging across metal. Then came the whispering, a chorus of voices, all speaking my name in unison. I swear it felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest. I looked at the book on my makeshift table, and in that instant, I was sure it was the source of whatever was happening. The symbols on the page seemed to twist and writhe, almost as if they were alive. My gut told me I'd unleash something by picking it up. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my lighter. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. I flicked the flame under the edges of a few pages, and the paper caught fire faster than I expected. The flames spread in seconds, curling the pages and releasing a dense, dark smoke. As the book burned, I heard this low, rumbling sound, like a distant thunderclap, but it came from all around me, not just one direction. The trailer seemed to vibrate, and the whispers turned into a single, drawn-out wail. It reminded me of a gust of wind slamming through a canyon, but it had this tortured quality that made my skin crawl. Then, just as abruptly, the noise cut off. The flickering light steadied, the shadows stopped moving, and that suffocating pressure lifted, like someone had finally opened a window. I opened the trailer door. Everything was still. The night sky was clear, and the silence was back to normal, like real silence, not that oppressive void from before. I swear I saw a faint silhouette near the edge of the sinkhole for a moment, those red eyes glowing, but then it vanished, disappearing into the night. I don't remember grabbing anything else. I just started the truck, hitched the trailer, and drove away without looking back. I never went back to that place. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw or heard. I've tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some weird electromagnetic field messing with the drone in my mind. Maybe the book was just a freaky antique with strange symbols. But I can't dismiss how real that presence felt, or the way it all suddenly stopped the moment I burned those pages. I'm sharing this because even now, I still dream about those glowing eyes at the pit's edge. It makes no sense, and I don't think it ever will. Part of me wonders if I stirred up something ancient by taking that book. All I know is that I'll never set foot anywhere near that sinkhole again. Some things are better left alone, especially when you're not prepared for what might be lurking in the darkness. Story 4. My name's Alex Grayson, I'm 34, and in 2020 I drove from my hometown of Westmont straight to Caprock Canyon State Park in Texas, hoping to capture some breathtaking shots of bison and rebuild my reputation as a photographer. I remember getting there early in the morning with a trailer full of camera gear and this nagging sense of excitement mixed with something else, like a heavy weight in my chest I couldn't explain. I shrugged it off at first. I mean, it's a remote area, and I'd been alone on the road for hours. Maybe I was just tired. The moment I parked my trailer in this isolated spot, the interior lights began flickering. I knew for sure my battery was brand new, so that made no sense. I tried not to overthink it. I just turned everything off, grabbed my camera, and decided to check out the park. The early sunlight was hitting the red canyon walls, and for a second I forgot my weird feeling. The views were stunning. The towering cliffs had layers of orange and crimson that almost glowed in the morning sun. I'd never seen anything like it. I started hiking a familiar-looking trail, scoping out bison in the distance. They were massive, grazing lazily on the open plains. I got a few shots I was proud of, but then I noticed something strange. Whenever I turned away to adjust my camera, it felt like the shapes of the canyon walls shifted. At first, I chalked it up to the changing light, but as I moved further along the path, it kept happening. I'd look at a specific formation, glance down at my camera, and when I looked up again, the rocks felt slightly off, like they'd been rearranged. It was subtle, but enough to make my stomach twist. Around midday, I stumbled upon this old, half-rusted signpost near a rocky outcrop. The writing was faded, but I could make out something about a woman who'd been executed for witchcraft back in 1871. The sign warned of a vengeful spirit haunting the area. I snapped a quick photo, thinking it might be a cool story to share on my blog, some spooky old legend. At the time, it honestly gave me chills, but I was still more curious than afraid. As I hiked back, the wind picked up out of nowhere, funneling through the canyons like a scream. Grit and dust whipped across my face, and I had to shield my eyes. I hurried to my trailer, which was only a short walk away. When I got inside, I noticed a faint tapping sound on the outer walls. It wasn't super loud, but it was persistent, almost rhythmic. I peered through the tiny window, expecting branches scraping against the metal or maybe some curious animal. But I saw nothing. Just empty terrain and the wind swirling up little dust devils. My nerves started getting the best of me. I decided to distract myself by looking through the photos I'd taken that morning. That's when I noticed something else bizarre. A good chunk of the images were blurry, almost distorted, with these strange black smears that sort of resembled silhouettes. It didn't look like lens flare or a camera glitch. They were shaped in ways that made my skin crawl, like people standing in the distance, but just out of focus. I tried zooming in, but it only got creepier. As afternoon faded, I wanted to catch the golden hour. I headed outside again, trudging to a spot overlooking the plains where I could see the bison roaming. But this time, one of them stood completely still in the middle of the path. I expected it to charge, or at least move away from me, but it barely blinked. I shouted and waved my arms, not wanting to get too close in case it spooked. Nothing. It was like it was frozen in place, staring off at the horizon. After a few tense minutes, I skirted around it, keeping my distance. The whole time, I couldn't shake the sensation that it wasn't just ignoring me. It was in some kind of trance. Not long after that, I realized the battery on my phone was almost dead, even though I'd charged it during the drive. When I tried to power it on again, it wouldn't respond. Great. No phone, no way to call for help if I needed it. My trailer still had some power, but the battery gauge was dropping faster than it should, like something was draining it. By now the sun was sinking, and the sky went from a soft orange to a deep purple. An unsettling feeling settled over everything. I walked back to my campsite, hearing nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional gust of wind. For a place that was usually alive with wildlife sounds, it was eerily quiet. When I got close, I heard what sounded like my own voice calling my name from somewhere behind the trailer. It was faint, but it definitely sounded like me. I froze. The hairs on my arms shot up, and I felt the blood pounding in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or some weird echo, but it kept going. "Alex, over here." That's when real fear kicked in. I crept around the side of the trailer, half expecting to see someone messing with me, but no one was there. I only saw these dark shapes perched on the rocks about 30 feet away, dozens of birds, maybe crows or vultures. They were completely silent, all facing my direction, like they were waiting for something. My stomach turned. I hurried inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. That's when a sudden flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder. The storm rolled in like it had been waiting for the perfect moment. The wind started hammering my trailer, and hail clattered against the metal like gunfire. I had no clue if it was safe to stay put, but going outside felt insane. Eventually, I noticed water leaking from the ceiling, so I grabbed some towels. That's when I heard that tapping again, but louder, like nails scraping along the walls. I mustered the courage to peek out the window, and in a flash of lightning, I saw a shape off to the side. It looked like a tall, thin woman, with her head bent at an odd angle, eyes reflecting the lightning. Then, just as quickly, she was gone. I realized staying in one spot might not be the best idea. I put on a rain jacket, stepped outside, and immediately spotted this strange formation of rocks and bones a few yards from my trailer. A makeshift altar, maybe. Bones tied together with what looked like hair and bits of feather. I felt like I was trespassing on something ancient and deeply wrong. Another flash of lightning lit it up, and I saw that tall figure again perched on a nearby boulder, staring right at me. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. By the time I aimed the light back, she was gone again. The storm raged for what felt like ages, but eventually it died down to a steady drizzle. The fear was like a living thing in my gut, and I just knew I had to leave before something worse happened. I rushed back into my trailer, turned the ignition, and prayed it would start. At first it sputtered, but then the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I tore out of that campsite, leaving tire marks in the mud as I sped away. I never wrote about this or published any photos. If I'm being honest, I don't even know if I still have them. Part of me thinks something followed me home, but that's probably just paranoia. Still, every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall figure with glowing eyes. I might be safe now, but there's a piece of me that feels Caprock Canyons isn't done with me. It's been years, and I still haven't found an explanation, and I'm not planning to go back to find one. Story 5. My name is Ethan Reed, and I still get chills whenever I think about what happened in the fall of 2018. I'd driven down from my hometown of Ashford to the Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. I planned to spend a few days documenting the bat colony and writing about the stunning sunsets along that deep canyon. It sounded like a peaceful enough trip, but what I experienced out there still haunts me. When I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was on its way down. I parked my old trailer near the famous sinkhole, a vertical drop of over 90 meters. The whole place felt deserted. There was no cell signal, no steady source of help, and the nearest sign of civilization was miles away. For a moment, I questioned whether I'd made a mistake coming alone. Right after I got settled, a park ranger in her 40s pulled up in an official truck. She stepped out, looked around, and gave me a stiff little nod. We exchanged basic greetings, and she asked if I knew about the area's stories. That word stuck with me. I told her I was there for the bats. She just shook her head, said something about the nights being treacherous, then told me not to linger too late. The way she spoke, like she was holding something back, made my skin prickle. That first evening, I set up my tripod to capture the bats leaving the sinkhole at dusk. It was incredible seeing thousands of them swirl out from the darkness below. As I filmed, I noticed a faint sound underneath the usual flutter and squeaking. It was almost like a melody, very low and muffled. Part of me thought it was just the wind blowing across the rim, but something about it felt off. It was too purposeful, like someone chanting in a distant tunnel. I tried to brush it aside, but it stayed in my head for the rest of the night. Back in the trailer, I made a quick meal and forced myself to sleep, half expecting to hear that chanting again through the thin walls. Thankfully, everything stayed silent, at least that night. The next evening, something else woke me up. I heard a rhythmic crunch of gravel outside, like wheels turning and hitting the ground. At first, I assumed it was another ranger's vehicle, or maybe some late-night tourists. But when I stepped out to check, there was nothing, just a sprawling emptiness and a weird, creeping fog that made it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. It was freezing cold, way colder than it should have been, and I felt a sudden wave of anxiety. I can't say why, but it was like everything in me screamed to get back inside. The air was heavy. My breath felt tight. I hurried into the trailer and locked the door. I stayed up for hours, listening for that gravel sound again. It never came back, but by the time I finally dozed off, I was on edge. But it was the following night that really did me in. I'd been sleeping fitfully, tossing and turning with weird half-dreams of bats and that eerie chant. Sometime deep into the night, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard those wheels again, only louder, like an entire caravan was rolling just outside my trailer. It was accompanied by the sound of horse hooves clopping on the stones. My heart went from 0 to 100 in seconds. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and crept to the window. As I peeked out, I nearly dropped the flashlight in shock. I swear I saw a line of old-fashioned wagons, their wooden spokes illuminated by a dull, bluish glow. The silhouettes of horses looked gaunt, and their eyes seemed to shine in the darkness. The people, if they were people at all, were dressed in clothing straight from a frontier-era painting. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, like they had all the time in the world. My chest tightened, and for a second, I actually forgot to breathe. I could see one figure in particular, a tall, dark silhouette, walking at the side of the lead wagon. It moved with this inhuman grace, like it was gliding instead of taking steps. When it reached the front of my trailer, it stopped. I could feel it looking straight at me through the window. The sheer weight of that gaze pressed on me, and I became aware of every beat of my heart thudding in my ears. Then I heard my name. I don't know how it spoke, but I knew it was calling for me. It said, "Ethan," like a distant whisper, yet it cut through the night as if it were right beside me. It made the hair on my arms stand up. My mind kept telling me to shut the blinds, to back away, but I was frozen, locked in that moment. The voice spoke of liberation from whatever plagues me. That's the word it used, liberation. To this day, I can't explain what that means or why it unsettled me so much, but it felt like a lure, a promise of something I did not want to discover. Everything in me was screaming to move, so I managed to yank down the curtain, scramble for the trailer door, and lock it. I could still hear movement outside, soft knocks, more whispered voices, faint hoarse snorts. My flashlight flickered and died in my hand, and I just stood in the dark, pressed against the thin metal wall, trembling. I don't know how much time passed, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually those sounds faded away like a retreating storm. I was too freaked out to sleep. The moment the first hint of dawn lit up the sky, I rushed to start the engine, ignoring how my hands shook on the steering wheel. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted out. The trailer rattled like crazy as I sped along the gravel roads. I kept checking my mirrors, half convinced I'd see that wagon train chasing behind me. But there was only the empty landscape, and after a while I realized I was alone again. I never mentioned the wagon story in the article I published. I stuck to describing the stunning bat emergence and the natural beauty of Devil's Sinkhole. A few close friends heard the real account, but most of them assumed I must have been sleep-deprived or freaked out by the isolation. I wish it were that simple. Even now, I still have nights where I wake up certain I can hear wheels crunching on gravel and distant horse hooves. It's like a faint echo that stays with me, and I'll catch myself straining to hear if anyone calls my name in that same hollow tone. Sometimes it's nothing, just my heart hammering in my chest. But every once in a while I swear I catch that same chant I heard on the first night. It always fades before I can pinpoint it. The rational part of my brain wants to label this as some nightmare or bizarre hallucination triggered by stress and the eerie setting. But deep down, something about it felt too real. I remember how the cold bit at my skin, the smell of old leather and damp earth, the way that tall figure stared at me like it could see all my fears at once. Those things don't feel like details you just imagine. I haven't been back to that part of Texas since, and I doubt I ever will. I don't have any big explanation or moral to the story. There's just this lingering question that keeps me up some nights wondering what would have happened if I opened that door and followed them. The thought terrifies me, because sometimes in the silence of the early morning, I almost think I hear them again, far off in the distance, waiting, and it makes me shiver all over. I have no idea what really visited me at the Devil's Sinkhole, but I'm convinced something was there, and I'm just glad I left when I did. That's all. I wish I could tie it up neatly, but it just ended. The day broke, and everything vanished like it was never there. Yet I can't shake the feeling that something remains unfinished, like they're still out there, maybe looking for me, or maybe just waiting for the next person who wanders in alone. I guess I'll never know, but I'll never forget it either. Story 6. I remember arriving at Enchanted Rock with high hopes for some great photos and local legends for my travel blog. My name is Claire Evans, and I'm 33 years old. This was back in 2021, when I left my quiet hometown of Templeton for the Texas Hill Country. The sky that day was ridiculously clear, and the huge pink granite formation stood out in the distance, shimmering just a bit under the midday sun. I parked my trailer at the designated camping area and felt this odd rush of excitement. I'd heard all sorts of stories about the place, but I never imagined I'd experience something so unsettling. The park was pretty busy when I got there, but I still managed to speak with Maggie, an older park ranger who seemed to know every inch of the land. She was welcoming but had this serious look when she mentioned that the rock was considered alive by some local tribes. She talked about drumming sounds at dusk and told me to be careful, almost like a friendly warning. I thought it was interesting folklore, one of those things you hear about, but never expect to really encounter. By mid-afternoon, I was hiking toward the top. The view was breathtaking, miles of rolling Texas landscape, cacti, and twisted oaks spread out below me. I spent at least an hour taking photos, feeling the hot sun beat down on my shoulders. No weird vibes at first. Everything seemed calm, but once it got close to sunset, I heard a faint drumming noise. It sounded like it was coming from inside the rock itself, but maybe it was just echoing from somewhere else. At first, I shrugged it off as my imagination. After all, you start expecting these spooky things when people warn you about them. But the sound got a bit louder, a consistent rhythmic beat. It reminded me of a distant tribal drum. I remembered Maggie's words about the drums and how you should keep your distance if you hear them. Instead of leaving, I stayed because I wanted to film it. Part of me was excited. I love capturing unusual stuff for my blog, but looking back, I regret not listening to her warning. The sound continued in short bursts, then faded, then picked up again. Eventually it got too dark to film anything useful, so I carefully made my way down to the campground. That night, I slept in my trailer, or at least I tried to. In the early morning, I discovered these strange scratch-like markings on the side of my trailer. They weren't random. It looked like someone, or something, had etched symbols. They looked tribal, almost like small glyphs or stylized animals, but I'm not an expert in that stuff. There were no footprints, no muddy tracks, no sign of who or what could have done it. Honestly, it felt like a warning. I tracked Maggie down later and showed her some photos. She looked genuinely concerned. She mentioned an old legend about a warrior who once pledged to protect the rock and punish anyone who disrespected it. Some say his spirit still roams around, drawing people closer with those drums. Hearing that gave me a chill. I wasn't sure I believed every detail, but the scratch marks had me on edge. That evening it all got way worse. I tried to stay inside my trailer once night fell, but around midnight, the drumming started again, louder than the previous day, almost circling around me. It was like the sound moved in a loop around the campsite, quiet on one side, then booming on the other. My heart pounded every time I heard it pass near my trailer walls. It felt like being stalked by something invisible. I kept my camera ready, but I couldn't get a clear shot of anything. All I got on the recordings was the faint pulse of that drum. At some point, maybe around 1 or 2 in the morning, I spotted a silhouette standing on top of the rock. It was tall and still, like it was watching me. The moonlight made it look like a statue. I felt every hair on my body rise. I can't explain it, but I was certain that figure was looking right at me, even though I couldn't see a face. I tried to snap a photo, but the flash lit up the darkness, and by the time my eyes refocused, the figure was gone. It felt like I was in some sort of ancient standoff, and I'd just failed a test I didn't even know I was taking. I decided to start a small fire outside, mostly for my own comfort. I kept thinking maybe the light or the smoke would keep whatever it was at bay. But then the drumming shifted into a soft murmuring sound. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely human-like whispers. It might sound insane, but I swear I heard my name carried by the wind. It was faint and drawn out, like Claire. I'm sure some people would say it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I've never felt terror like that. My stomach flipped, and my hands started shaking so hard I could barely keep the fire stoked. I remember whispering back to the darkness that I was leaving, that I meant no harm. I guess I was trying to reason with something I couldn't see. Gradually, the noise died down. The wind settled, and the night was eerily silent. I stayed by the dying embers of my fire until dawn, too afraid to try and sleep. My eyes were heavy, and I felt drained, but adrenaline kept me alert. As soon as the first hint of daylight broke, I packed my gear in a rush. I didn't care about being thorough. I just wanted out of there. Maggie showed up around sunrise. She didn't need to ask how my night went. She could see it on my face. She simply nodded and said it was best I was going. I didn't bother pressing her for more details about the legend or the warrior's spirit. At that point, I just wanted to leave. The minute I drove off, a strange calm washed over me, like the rock itself had stopped pulsating in the back of my head. The drums were gone, and the air felt lighter. To this day, I still can't fully explain what happened on those 2 nights. I've camped in plenty of supposedly haunted or sacred places before, but nothing ever felt as real and direct as that experience on Enchanted Rock. Sometimes I lie awake thinking about the markings on my trailer, how precise they were, and how they vanished after a few washes, almost like they were never there. I still have photos, but looking at them makes me uneasy. I've never posted them publicly because, honestly, I'm not sure I want more questions. Even now, I get chills when I think about those distant drums and that silent figure watching me. Everything stopped as suddenly as it started, and I'm left not knowing why. I've tried to convince myself it was just folklore mixed with my imagination, but something in my gut tells me it was more than that. Enchanted Rock lives up to its name in ways I wish I hadn't witnessed. I respect that place deeply, and if anyone asks whether the legends are real, I never say no. All I can do is share what I felt and saw, and let them decide for themselves. Story 7. My name is Megan Torres. I'm 30 years old, and back in 2020, I left my hometown of Fairview for a quick trip to Devil's Backbone in Texas. I was honestly just craving a change of scenery, and that place had always intrigued me because of all the rumors about weird happenings. I brought my trailer, my boyfriend Jason came along, and so did my friend Lisa. She invited this guy named Evan, who I barely knew at the time, but I figured more people just meant more fun, or at least I hoped so. We hit the road early in the morning, planning to cram our entire adventure into a single day, drive in, explore, camp overnight, and head home the next morning. The drive there was smooth, and at first glance, the Devil's Backbone was stunning. Rolling hills, layers of rocky ridges. It looked way too pretty to have such creepy legends. But as soon as we got close, I felt something, almost like the air got heavier. We parked the trailer, and the silence just surrounded us. No birds, no distant cars, nothing. It was almost like the scenery was holding its breath. We set up camp around midday. Jason was talking non-stop about all the spooky tales he had read online, making jokes about seeing ghostly wagon trains or hearing horse hooves at night. Lisa was on edge, double-checking details on her phone about local lore. Evan barely said a word, just watched us like he didn't fully trust the place. Or us, I'm not sure. I tried to shake off the weird vibe. Maybe everyone was just tired from the long drive. Once the trailer was settled and our stuff was somewhat organized, we headed out on a short hiking trail that cut across the top of the ridge. The sky looked so bright, and the wind brushed past us in these little gusts that felt refreshing. For a moment, I thought maybe the day would turn around and we'd just have a normal, chilled trip. But about an hour in, we came across these strange carvings in a big slab of rock, some kind of faded symbols or designs. They didn't look like regular graffiti. They had a sort of ancient feel. Jason shrugged it off as interesting but not important. Lisa got visibly nervous. She whispered something about local tribes and warnings. Evan just stared at the symbols like they meant something bad. We didn't linger there long because the sun was dipping lower, and we wanted to get back to the trailer before nightfall. On our way, the quiet started to get to me. Usually, in a place like that, you'd hear insects or birds, but there was nothing. Even our footsteps sounded muffled. That sense of isolation made me uneasy, but I tried to keep cool. When we got back, we lit a small campfire outside the trailer. For a while, it was almost fun. Jason teasing Lisa about ghosts, me trying to get Evan to open up a bit. But deep down, I knew something felt off. Night settled in fast. The sky got dark so quickly it was like someone flicked a switch. We moved inside the trailer after a while, sat around on the small couch and tried to relax. Then I heard this sound, like the wind was moaning or wheezing. At first I thought it was just the wind building up against the ridges, but it didn't sound natural. It had this weird rhythm, almost like breath mixed with rustling leaves. My heart started pounding because it got louder every few seconds, then faded, then came back. Jason looked at me with this half-smile, trying to act tough, but he was on edge too. Lisa kept glancing at the windows. She said she felt like someone was outside. Evan stayed near the door, arms folded, like he was ready to bolt at any moment. I tried to calm everyone down by saying it was probably an echo of the wind through the rocks, but I didn't buy it myself. A few hours into the night, could have been around midnight, I'm not exactly sure, I heard a distinct crunch of gravel outside. It was too heavy to be just the wind blowing some branches. I froze, waiting to see if Jason or Lisa heard it too. Then Lisa whispered, "Did you hear that?" And I nodded. Evan moved to peek out a window, but there was only darkness, not a single light source out there, except our own small lantern inside. We turned off the trailer's lights for a moment to see if we could spot anything in the darkness. That's when I picked up on this faint clicking sound, like hooves on rock. It was so soft, but I swear it sounded like a horse walking slowly around. Jason tried to joke. Well, guess the old wagon stories might be true, but the expression on his face was dead serious. The clicking and moaning wind kept circling us, almost like it was testing us. Then something even weirder happened. I heard what sounded like my own voice, very distant, calling out. At first I couldn't make out the words. It was more like an echo. Then I heard my name, Megan, almost stretching in the air, followed by laughter that mimicked my tone, but warped, like a broken recording. My skin crawled, and I had this sudden urge to cover my ears. I locked eyes with Jason, and I saw pure fear. Lisa was already trembling. Evan finally spoke up, saying he'd heard stories of something around here that lures people with voices they recognize. I felt claustrophobic inside the trailer, but I was too terrified to go out. It was like we were stuck in this bubble of darkness, with those noises prowling around us. At one point, Jason grabbed a small camping knife and yelled through the door for whoever was out there to leave us alone. Silence followed for just a moment, but then the moaning wind came back, louder, like it was mocking him. Lisa started panicking, saying she wanted to leave right then. We all agreed we should pack up, but it wasn't a simple task in the pitch black, especially with the sense that something was circling us. Plus, the roads were narrow and winding. Trying to drive out of there in total darkness felt like its own nightmare. We decided to wait for first light, but none of us wanted to sleep. About an hour before dawn, the noises escalated. I heard what sounded like multiple voices, Jason's laugh, Lisa's gasp, Evan's monotone voice, repeating our names and whispering weird phrases we'd said earlier in the day. It was almost as if something had been listening to our conversations and was now throwing our own words back at us in the creepiest ways possible. The trailer walls felt too thin. Every small rustle made me jump, and my heart was practically in my throat. Lisa kept sobbing quietly, and Jason's knuckles turned white from gripping that knife. Evan was the only one who seemed sort of composed, but his eyes were wide like he was in shock. Finally, the first hint of light broke over the horizon. We didn't waste a second. Jason started the car, and we scrambled to gather our stuff. I heard something scrape against the side of the trailer, like metal dragging across it, but I didn't look back. I just wanted to get the hell out. We pulled out of our makeshift campsite, practically bouncing over the rocky trail that led back to the main road. The sun was rising, and with each minute that passed, the creepy noises faded. By the time we hit the more populated roads, it was as though nothing had happened at all, like that place had swallowed the night into its hills, leaving us frazzled and exhausted. Even now, I can't fully explain what we experienced. It was too real to be just the wind or some echo effect. The voices, the hooves, the bizarre feeling that something was out there trying to imitate us. It still keeps me up at night sometimes. Lisa refuses to go camping anywhere remote anymore, and she barely talks about that night. Jason stopped making jokes about haunted places after this. As for me, I just don't have an answer. We drove away, and the horror stopped as abruptly as it began. I've told this story to a few people, but it always sounds insane. Yet I know what I felt, and I know those voices sounded exactly like us, down to our laughs and words. I still think about it every now and then, especially whenever I'm out in the countryside and the wind gets a certain pitch. It's like a reminder that some places hold on to things we don't understand, and maybe never will. All I know is that whatever lurks in Devil's backbone is old and very good at mimicking. And sometimes walking away is the only thing you can do, even if you never figure out why it all happened in the first place. Story 8. I never thought I'd share this, but it keeps bothering me, and I'm hoping letting it out might help. My name is Ethan Mallory. I'm 38 years old, and back in 2021, I left Aurora Springs to find some solitude in the Davy Crockett National Forest down in Texas. I was going through some really rough times and believed that being surrounded by pine trees and quiet trails would give me the mental break I desperately needed. I drove my trailer out there and parked in this little hidden spot. The place was basically a clearing I'd scouted on Google Maps, a patch of land that looked isolated enough for me to switch off my mind and just breathe. Once I got there, it felt like I'd found the perfect refuge. The tall pines rustled in the breeze, creating this soothing sound that almost lulled me to sleep whenever I stopped moving. But it didn't take long for me to sense that something was off. I spent the whole afternoon wandering around the nearby trails. My phone barely had any signal, but I figured that was good. I wanted to disconnect after all. The first red flag came when my compass started spinning weirdly near certain spots. I'd hold it in my palm, and it would just twist around like it couldn't settle on north. I shrugged it off, blaming old equipment or something. But then I noticed these strange symbols carved into some trees, spirals, little stick figures, random shapes I'd never seen before. I remember running my fingers over one of them and feeling a chill, like the bark was somehow colder than the rest of the trunk. It made me uneasy, so I backed away and decided to return to my trailer before dark. That first night was when everything escalated. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the wind, when I heard a whisper outside. It sounded like my name, Ethan, but so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the breeze. Still, something about the tone made the hairs on my arms stand up. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing, just silence so deep it was unnerving. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I got up early, determined to explore deeper into the forest. I felt this odd pull, like the place was challenging me to see more of it. But as I hiked further, I noticed the trees got denser, and the light struggled to make it down through the canopy. The temperature dropped too, even though it was a warm season. My phone lost the tiny bit of signal it had, and no matter which way I turned, it felt like I was moving in circles. My compass kept spinning again, and I couldn't get a proper bearing. At one point, I stumbled onto this narrow pathway lined by more of those symbols, etched into almost every trunk. Some looked like they'd been carved decades ago, while others seemed fresh, like someone had just finished them. I remember rubbing the back of my neck, trying to shake off a sense of being watched. The air felt heavier there, almost suffocating. That's when I heard it again. My name. But this time, it was unmistakable, like a voice right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. No rustling, no sign of footsteps, nothing. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. I practically sprinted back to my trailer, deciding that I'd had enough. Maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace for such an isolated trip. But when I tried to start up the engine, it wouldn't even turn over. I checked everything. The battery, the fuel, the connections. Everything seemed fine, but it was dead. I tried not to panic, figuring I'd stay one more night and then figure out a way to get help in the morning. As the day wore on, I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the underbrush around my campsite. I'd step out and look around, but never caught anyone. I forced myself to eat something, then stayed close to the trailer, half hoping someone would pass by on a trail so I could ask for help. But it was dead quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Night came faster than I expected, and with it, the same eerie whispering, only this time it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like multiple voices circling around me, but they weren't saying anything coherent. I caught snippets of words, and to my horror, some were things I'd said earlier that day, like an echo of my own voice, but twisted and distorted. I can't describe how disturbing it is to hear your own words repeated back in this hollow, mocking tone from somewhere outside your window. I remember feeling so helpless. I just sat there gripping my flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. That's when I remembered a story I'd heard about burning sage or salvia to cleanse negative energy. I wasn't superstitious, but at that point I was desperate. I had found a small bundle of salvia at a local store near the forest entrance a few days before, one of those random impulse buys. I dug it out, lit it, and let the smoke fill the trailer. Almost immediately the voices dimmed, like they'd been muffled. For a second, I actually thought it was working. But then I started hearing these soft giggles, almost like little kids laughing. Every time I inched toward the window, the laughter would fade, only to come back from the opposite side of the trailer. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The trailer's thin walls didn't feel like much protection. I just tried to focus on breathing slowly, keeping calm, reminding myself it would pass. Eventually, the voices got quieter, and I must have drifted off out of sheer exhaustion. I woke up to the faint light of dawn. My first instinct was to check outside, though a part of me was terrified of what I'd see. And sure enough, the ground was full of weird footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like small, almost human footprints, but the spacing was off, like whoever, or whatever, made them took short, deliberate steps in circles around my trailer. I counted maybe a dozen distinct tracks, all overlapping each other, forming this bizarre looping pattern. I didn't waste any more time. I hopped back into the trailer's cab, heart pounding, and tried the engine again. This time, it started right up, like nothing had ever been wrong. It was almost like the forest had decided I could leave now. Shaking, I turned the trailer around and headed straight for the main road. When I finally got back to some semblance of civilization, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and check everything. The engine was fine, the tires were fine, the battery was at full capacity. There was no logical explanation for why it had refused to start the night before. I thought about telling someone at the station what happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who'd believe a story about disembodied whispers and footprints? Later, when I looked through the photos I'd taken on my phone from the first hike, I noticed some odd shapes in the background. At first, I assumed it was just shadows or tree trunks, but the more I zoomed in, the more they looked like faint silhouettes standing among the pines. They didn't match the tree line or the rocks I remembered. It almost looked like figures, maybe 4 or 5, just staring from a distance. I never went back to that forest. I'm not even sure what I experienced was fully real, or if it was some kind of feverish breakdown from stress. But every so often, I have these dreams where I'm back in that clearing, hearing my name in the wind, feeling that same chill crawl up my spine. And even though it all stopped as suddenly as it started, I can't shake the feeling that something wanted me to cross that invisible boundary, and that it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. To this day, I can't explain any of it. I don't have neat answers or a grand revelation, just lingering questions that make my chest tighten whenever I think about them. All I know is that whatever happened in Davy Crockett National Forest was enough to make me realize that some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and sometimes the quiet you think you're looking for can come with its own nightmares. Story 9. My name is Ryan Fields. I'm 39, and back in 2021, I drove all the way from Rutherford to the Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas, hoping to find some much-needed peace. I'd spent years working as a conflict correspondent, and my head was constantly replaying scenes I wished I could forget. That desert landscape felt like my best shot at quieting my mind. The plan was simple: park my trailer near McKittrick Canyon, photograph the rugged scenery, and maybe write a personal piece about finding solace. I arrived early that morning, the sky still a bit pale, and set up my trailer just off one of the main dirt roads. The first half of the day was normal, I hiked through the rocky trails, tried to capture the towering limestone cliffs on my camera, and soaked up the wide-open silence. The dryness of the air and the emptiness of the land felt oddly reassuring, like I could finally exhale after years of tension. Sometime in the afternoon, I headed back toward the park entrance to grab a few supplies from this small shop I'd spotted on my way in. That's when I met Maria. She was restocking shelves and gave me a polite smile before striking up a conversation. Eventually, she asked if I'd heard of something called the Devil's Smile. She said it was a local legend about a dark presence that apparently roams these mountains at night. I remember chuckling, convinced it was just folklore designed to intrigue tourists. But Maria didn't laugh with me. She looked dead serious. She told me to be cautious and said people who've scoffed at the legend sometimes found themselves spooked in ways they couldn't explain. I tried not to sound dismissive, so I just thanked her, grabbed what I needed, and returned to my trailer as the sun started dipping below the ridges. That evening, the wind picked up big time. My trailer rattled like an old tin can, the gusts slamming into it from different angles. There was something ominous about it, like a warning sign. But I was pretty tired from the hike and figured I'd just settle in, make some dinner, and maybe get an early night. Then I heard it, my name, whispered in this deep voice, like it was right behind my ear. Ryan. The first time I heard it, I froze. There was no one around. The windows were shut, and I was alone. So I told myself I must have been hallucinating, maybe from being overly stressed or just on edge. But then it happened again, only louder, like someone was standing outside the trailer, calling me through the walls. I swear my blood went cold. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. The desert night felt unbelievably still, except for the wind that came in bursts. I saw nothing but darkness and a few twisted silhouettes of shrubs. No footsteps, no sign that anyone else was out there. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself it could be the wind messing with my head. Yet the feeling of being watched was so strong, it left my nerves jangling. I headed back in and tried to refocus by reviewing the photos I'd taken earlier. While flipping through them, I noticed something weird in the background of one shot. A faint, shadowy outline, almost like a person standing far behind the rocks. I zoomed in, but the figure was too distorted to make out any features. The only thing that struck me was what looked like a grin, stretched too wide, as if the mouth was bigger than it should be. I tried to ignore it, blaming my camera for picking up random shapes in the shadows. Night fell completely by then, and the wind only got worse. Every so often I'd hear a scratch on the side of the trailer, like claws scraping metal. It would come in short bursts, then stop, then start again. It wasn't constant, but just enough to keep my heart pounding. Suddenly the lights flickered. All the electronics in the trailer seemed to glitch, and my small heater cut out with a low buzz. That's when I heard this slow, dragging sound against the door. Not knocking, not pounding, just something heavy sliding across the metal. I rushed over and locked the door, trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing. There was nowhere else to go in the middle of nowhere, no quick escape without stepping into pitch-black darkness. I heard my name again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like multiple whispers layering on top of each other, all saying Ryan, drawn out, almost hissing. My hands were shaking so bad, I struggled to hold my flashlight. I remembered the small iron cross my grandmother had given me years ago. I usually kept it in a side pocket of my camera bag, more for sentimental value than anything else. Something in me just needed to grab it. Maybe I wanted to feel close to her strength, or maybe I hoped it'd keep whatever was out there at bay. I clutched it so hard it left indents in my palm. I could feel the trailer's walls vibrating, not from the wind, but from this horrible tension, like the air was charged with electricity. The scratching noises seemed to spread around the trailer, like something was circling it, I was so scared my mind started playing tricks. I thought I saw a dark silhouette at the window, but when I aimed the flashlight, there was nothing. The sibilant whispers kept coming, like a group of voices chanting in some low, throaty tone, slurring words I couldn't quite make out. Desperate, I lit a small stick of incense I'd brought for relaxation, hoping the smell and the ritual would calm me down. I paced back and forth, repeating in my head that this wasn't real, that stress can do terrible things to the mind. Slowly, almost too conveniently, the sounds outside softened. The wind died down, the scratching noise faded, and the trailer felt still. The silence was overwhelming, but I told myself that maybe whatever it was had moved on, or maybe it had never been there at all. Somehow I managed to doze off for a bit, but when I woke up at dawn, I half wondered if I'd dreamt the whole thing. Yet the moment I stepped outside, I found these odd footprints in the dirt around my trailer. They looked human, but off. The toes seemed longer, and the outer edges were smudged, almost like something with a different shape was pressing into the ground. The tracks wandered in strange circles and stopped abruptly near a cluster of rocks, as if they'd vanished into thin air. That sealed the deal for me. There was no way I was staying another minute. I packed up as fast as I could, trembling with an anxious mix of relief and dread. Before leaving, I checked my camera again, mostly out of habit, and scrolled through the pictures from the previous evening. Several were distorted, with weird smears of shadow that almost looked like faces. Some images had a haze in the background that formed what appeared to be a wide grin, stretched way too far, matching the shape I'd noticed before. My stomach churned, and I slammed the camera shut. I wanted to erase all of it, but couldn't bring myself to do it in that moment. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I drove down that dirt road so fast, the trailer kicked up a cloud of dust behind me. I barely glanced in the rearview mirror, worried I might see something chasing me. The main highway felt like salvation. By the time I merged onto the open road, my heart was still pounding, and my mind was in total disbelief. Part of me kept thinking about Maria's warning, her eyes full of concern when she mentioned the devil's smile. I realized too late that this wasn't just some local ghost story or a cheap scare for tourists. Something in that place felt genuinely wrong. I never published any of the photos I took that day, and I don't really talk about the devil's smile outside of rare moments like this. I still have the memory card with those distorted images, but I haven't looked at them in a long time. Every now and then, the memory creeps up on me, especially when I'm alone in a dark room. I'll hear a soft whisper of my name, even though no one else is around, and I'll get that same chilling sensation as if something is standing just behind me, smiling. I've got no rational explanation for what happened in Guadalupe Mountains. All I know is that it felt completely real as anything I experienced in war zones, and that's saying something. One day, things were normal, and then suddenly, they weren't. It all began and ended within those hours out there, leaving me with more questions than answers. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that some presence in those mountains latched onto me for a moment, showing me a glimpse of something I'll never fully understand. And to be honest, I'm okay with never understanding it. Story 10. My name is Carol Linfield. I'm 34, and in 2021, I drove out of my quiet hometown of Summersville to spend a day in the Sam Houston National Forest near Lake Conroe in Texas. I was planning to do a quick piece for my blog about lesser-known nature spots, figuring it would be a peaceful break from the usual tourist traps. I rented a small trailer for the day, parked it in a rustic campsite, and realized pretty quickly that I was practically the only person around. Right after I got there in the late morning, I noticed how still everything felt. I'm used to hearing wind rustling leaves or the usual hum of insects, but the air felt oddly heavy. I was unloading my gear when an older park ranger named Evan pulled up in a beat-up Jeep. He had silvery hair, a well-worn uniform, and the most serious expression I've ever seen on a ranger. He gave my trailer a once-over, then turned to me and quietly said, "If you hear whispers, don't answer." I let out a short laugh, thinking it was some local campfire tale, but he just stared at me, didn't crack a smile, then drove off without another word. It stuck with me, but I tried to brush it off as some local joke. The rest of the afternoon was pretty normal, at least at first. I explored the nearby pines, snapped a bunch of photos for my blog, and wandered toward Lake Conroe. On my way down the trail, I nearly bumped into this woman who looked like she was in a real hurry. She told me her name was Maddie, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like something was following her. She said, "The voices, they called me again," like I should know what she was talking about. Then she practically ran off, telling me I should leave too before nightfall. It threw me off balance because she looked so genuinely unsettled. By the time I got back to my trailer, the sky was starting to dim. A slight breeze rustled the pine needles, but it still felt too quiet for a forest. I tried to focus on setting up a small campfire and double-checking my camera equipment, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. Around dusk, I swear I heard a soft tap on the side of the trailer, like someone gently rapping their knuckles. I opened the little window, stuck my head out, and found nothing but trees fading into the dark. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing. I started feeling on edge, so I lit my fire a bit bigger than usual, just for some extra light. I also pulled out my phone to check for a signal. Barely one bar. Figures, right? I was about to brush everything aside and start writing notes for my blog when I realized something. The usual forest sounds were gone. No crickets chirping, no small rustling in the brush, no distant bird calls. It felt like being in a vacuum. That's when I heard the first whisper. It was so faint, I wasn't even sure it was real. It sounded like my name, Carol, but dragged out in this eerie hush, like wind blowing through a crack in a door. My heart dropped. I immediately thought of Evan's words. "If you hear whispers, don't answer." I pretended I didn't hear anything, just sat there by my fire, hugging my jacket. But the whisper came again. And then another voice joined it, sounding different, but also whispering my name. It was coming from multiple directions, or at least that's how it felt. I jumped up, freaked out, and decided maybe I should just lock myself in my trailer. Once inside, I tried to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking, but in that little trailer, every small noise outside seemed amplified. I heard soft scraping, then a dull thud. I clenched my eyes shut, telling myself it was just a branch or a squirrel. But the scraping turned into a deliberate knock. In total panic, I looked through the tiny door window. Nothing was out there. But as soon as I did, I heard a voice from outside. It was my own voice, like a distorted playback, going, "Carol, let me in." My blood ran cold. I can't describe the feeling of hearing your own voice speaking to you from outside in the dark. It's just wrong. I fell back from the door, remembering Evan's warning, and I kept telling myself not to respond. Everything went quiet for a minute, which felt worse in a way, because my thoughts were spinning. I remembered I had some dried sage in my bag. I usually keep it around for random smudging rituals when traveling. It felt silly, but at that point, I was desperate for anything that might help me feel safer. I lit the sage bundle and walked around the inside of the trailer, letting the smoke fill the corners. As I did, I heard another whisper outside, sort of a hiss of disapproval. That unsettled me even more. But then something shifted. The outside noises started fading, like that presence was slowly backing off. After a few minutes of tense silence, I worked up the courage to open the door and shine my flashlight around. The campsite was empty, no sign of footprints or anything near the fire ring. But as I circled back to check the trailer wheels, I caught sight of some weird patterns in the dirt, almost like braided lines or swirling shapes carved into the ground. I'd never seen anything like it. They were arranged in a circle around my trailer, like someone had carefully drawn them there. I leaned in to touch the dirt, and my stomach lurched when I noticed small indentations that looked like handprints, but with extra long fingers. That was the final straw. I didn't care about finishing my blog post or staying to photograph the sunrise. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, and all I wanted was to get the hell out. I scrambled into the trailer, shoved everything into my bags, and started up the engine. For a few awful seconds, it refused to turn over, making that terrible sputtering noise that always signals a dead battery. But then, out of nowhere, it started. I barely let the engine warm up before tearing down that dirt road, bumping and rattling until I reached the main highway. The strangest part is that, once I got about a mile or so from the campsite, I heard normal forest sounds again. Crickets, frogs, night birds. The air felt lighter, like that suffocating atmosphere had never existed. It was like stepping out of a nightmare. I glanced in the rearview mirror more than once, half expecting something to appear in my tail lights. But there was nothing, just darkness. I ended up sharing what happened on an anonymous forum, hoping someone else had a rational explanation. Turns out a few people responded, saying they'd had similar encounters in the area, whispering voices, strange symbols, hearing their own names from invisible sources. Some folks were convinced it was just local folklore or mass hysteria. Others hinted at something darker. I decided not to include any of this in my blog. I just felt like writing about it publicly would either make people think I was nuts, or worse, encourage thrill-seekers to show up there unprepared. And honestly, even recalling it here has my heart pounding all over again. I can't explain what happened in that forest, and I don't think I ever will. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, I still dream about that voice calling my name, asking to be let in. And every time I wake up shaking, grateful I never answered, because I'm not sure I'd still be here if I had. It all happened so fast, and then it was over, just as suddenly. I don't have a neat conclusion, and maybe that's what's so unsettling about it. It started, then stopped, and I'll probably never know why. Story 11. I still get chills whenever I think back to the day we pulled our rickety old trailer into that isolated patch of desert in Big Bend. It was 2021, and I was 29 at the time, desperate for a break from Brookhaven's monotony. Jake and Sam, my closest friends, were just as excited as I was to explore the Chisos Basin. But from the moment we parked the trailer in that eerie pocket of land, I had a sinking feeling we shouldn't have been there. The day started off normally enough. We arrived mid-morning, the sky an endless stretch of pale blue. The road leading to our spot was rugged, and at one point we nearly got stuck in a dip filled with loose sand. By the time we found a place to set up camp, I was exhausted. Red rocks towered around us, carved into strange shapes by centuries of wind. I remember the silence being almost unsettling. There was no birdsong, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. It felt like the land was holding its breath. Jake got a small fire going to ward off the creeping cold. Despite the midday sun, that desert can be brutally chilly if the wind picks up. The three of us sat around, warming our hands and joking about how we'd probably end up scaring ourselves silly later. Jake brought up local legends he'd heard, apparitions in the desert, voices in the wind. Sam, a former park ranger, brushed it all off, claiming bored locals or imaginative hikers probably fueled those stories. I tried to laugh along, but a part of me couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. As afternoon bled into early evening, the temperature dropped sharply. That's when everything started to feel off. The wind picked up, and every gust sounded like a low moan weaving through the rocks. We huddled around the fire and cooked some canned chili, but I kept glancing over my shoulder at the trailer. The windows were dusty, reflecting only darkness inside. It felt like I was being drawn to look at them, like something was on the other side, peering back out. Sometime after sunset, we noticed a strange quiet settle over the area. The wind slowed to a near stop, and it was like our camp was sealed inside a bubble of heavy silence. Jake broke it by telling a story about a shapeshifter that supposedly lurked around the region, mimicking people's voices. He was half laughing, half serious, but I could tell he was spooked by the hushed atmosphere. Sam just shook his head and said we should focus on waking up early for the hike the next morning. I don't know what compelled me, but I stood up and walked around the trailer to get something from inside, maybe a sweater. The moment I turned the corner, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. It was thin, almost like a tall silhouette shifting behind a rock. I froze, heart pounding. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the firelight, but then it moved again, so smoothly it didn't seem human. I called out, "Jake?" But his voice came from the other side of the trailer near the fire, replying, "Yeah?" That's when I realized whoever, or whatever, I saw wasn't one of us. I hurried back to the fire and told them what I'd seen. Jake immediately went to check, flashlight in hand, but found nothing except a few scuffs in the dirt that might have been footprints, or could have just been random patterns. Sam tried to remain rational, but I could see the worry in his eyes too. Something had definitely been there. Night pressed down hard on our tiny campsite. The fire crackled, but the darkness beyond felt heavy. We decided to lock ourselves in the trailer early, even though it was barely past 9. It was cramped in there, with a single flickering lantern casting shadows on every surface. I remember the smell of old cushions and stale air. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, listening to every scratch or bump outside. And then I heard it. The soft sound of my own name being called. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it happened again. Emma, drawn out, as though someone was right outside the trailer wall. My stomach did a flip, because it sounded just like Jake's voice. But I could see Jake at the other end of the trailer, asleep in his sleeping bag. I whispered to Sam to see if he'd heard anything. He just mumbled something and rolled over. My heart hammered against my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't move. I wanted to shout, but my throat tightened with fear. The scratching came next, a scrape along the metal side of the trailer. My first thought was that it might be an animal. But as I held my breath, I realized the scratches were paste, almost like someone was dragging their nails across the trailer in a deliberate rhythmic pattern. I mustered the courage to peek through the grimy window. It was pitch black outside, illuminated only by the last embers of our dying fire. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the faint glow, a shape slid out of view, too quick for me to track. I nearly jumped out of my skin when there was a knock at the door, 3 taps, slow and deliberate. My name came again, more insistent. Emma. I felt tears prick my eyes because it still sounded like Jake. But Jake was right there, murmuring in his sleep. I scrambled to wake him. He jerked awake, disoriented, and asked what was going on. I just pointed at the door, practically hyperventilating. Sam sat up, wide-eyed. No one dared open it. We stared at each other, silently agreeing not to move. That's when the door handle started jiggling. My lungs locked up, and all I could do was stare. It felt like hours before it finally stopped. We heard footsteps circling the trailer, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Then, nothing. Jake slowly reached for the lantern, turned it off to keep us hidden, and we all just sat there in the dark, listening. Outside, the wind began to howl, but it seemed to carry a hiss, almost a whisper, that rose and fell around us. It was like something was prowling out there, trying to lure us out. I'll never forget the fear in Jake's eyes. The fearless friend who always cracked jokes and teased me about my nerves looked genuinely terrified. At some point, Sam gasped and pointed to the window. A pale face pressed up against the glass for just a moment. It was gone in a blink, but I saw dark eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. That single glimpse was enough to make me clamp a hand over my mouth so I wouldn't scream. The trailer's walls felt paper thin, and I was terrified whatever was out there would just punch through and grab us. We must have dozed off out of sheer exhaustion, because I remember waking up to a metallic thud that rattled the whole trailer. Dawn was creeping in, and the inside of the trailer was tinged with a greyish light. Jake threw open the window curtain, and we saw that the door was ajar. Something had forced it open in the night. Outside, the wind had died down again, and in the sand around the trailer were footprints, long, narrow shapes, like a person's tracks, but somehow off, like the gate was too wide or the angles were wrong. We didn't speak much as we scrambled to pack our stuff. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip my bag. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his face sheet white. Sam was silent, which was out of character for him. I think we were all trying to hold it together and not lose our minds. The second everything was stowed, Jake started the engine, and we peeled out of there without a single goodbye to that cursed spot. Even now, whenever I see desert landscapes on TV or online, I get that knot in my gut again. I can't erase the memory of those footprints, that face at the window, or the voice calling my name. I've run through all the logical explanations. Maybe it was some twisted prank or someone out there messing with us. But part of me can't shake the feeling that it was something else, something that shouldn't exist in the realm of things we can easily explain. I haven't gone back to Big Bend since. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about that day, wondering what would have happened if we'd opened the door or followed that voice. It scares me more than I like to admit. I still don't have answers, and I doubt I ever will. All I know is that whatever lurks in those desert shadows felt ancient, intelligent, and malevolent. And if it ever calls my name again, I'm praying I'll be far, far away. Story 12. My name is Anna Mitchell. I'm 24, and this happened back in 2021. I still can't make sense of it. I drove out of Burnsville with two of my best friends, Tyler and Liz, for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at Caprock Canyon State Park in Texas. We brought a simple trailer, nothing fancy, and parked it in a quiet spot overlooking those red cliffs. Everything looked picture perfect. Wide open skies, huge rock formations, and the occasional bison roaming by. At first, I thought it would be the highlight of our summer. The minute we arrived, though, I felt something heavy in the air. It's hard to describe. Liz, who'd been working grueling night shifts at the hospital, mentioned reading about weird disappearances in that region. Tyler shrugged it off and told us not to worry. He's usually the optimistic one, always cracking jokes, but even he got quiet for a second when we first stepped out of the car. There was this hush all around, like the park was waiting for us to make a mistake. As the sun started to set, the wind picked up. It made the strangest noise as it rushed through the rocks, like a distant howl that changed pitch in an almost human way. Tyler thought it was hilarious and started mimicking a wolf, but the sound came out so off-putting and eerie that Liz practically begged him to stop. I remember laughing a little to ease the tension, but deep down, it didn't feel right. Everything was too silent before that wind howled, and once it did, it sounded almost alive. Later that night, we lit a small fire and tried to talk about lighter stuff, random stories from college, music we were into. But Liz kept circling back to local legends and old stories about spirits in these canyons. Tyler rolled his eyes, said it was all nonsense, but I could tell he was slightly on edge. I was just trying to stay neutral, reminding myself we were there to have a good time. The sky was crazy clear, though. I'd never seen so many stars in my life. Somehow, It didn't feel comforting. It felt like they were watching us, like every star was an eye. I went to bed fairly late, and it must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up to this metallic scraping sound on the side of our trailer. It wasn't super loud, but it was sharp enough to jerk me awake instantly. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to wake Tyler or Liz, so I grabbed a flashlight and slowly unlatched the door. Outside, it was pitch black. No moonlight, no camping lantern, just my small flashlight beam. The wind was still blowing, but it was oddly warm for that time of night, and I remember the hair on my arms standing on end. I scanned the area around our trailer, shining the light on the ground first. Nothing unusual. Then I aimed the flashlight up at the trailer's side and saw nothing but a couple of faint scratches near the back wheel. It could have been from branches or an animal, but I swear, when I turned to check the darkness around me, it felt like something darted behind a rock formation. I only caught a flicker of movement. I told myself it was probably my imagination, but I couldn't shake that sense of being watched. I practically ran back inside and locked the door. In the morning, I showed Tyler the scratch marks. They weren't deep or anything, but they had this weird uniformity, almost parallel lines. He joked that it must have been a raccoon with a weird sense of humor, but even as he said that, I saw a hint of worry in his eyes. Liz didn't even want to look. She just insisted we stick together and not wander off alone. Despite her concerns, Tyler was set on exploring the park to get some drone footage of the canyons. He said that was half the reason we came. So we prepared our backpacks, brought plenty of water, and headed out around midday. The trail was stunning, towering red cliffs, cactus plants here and there, and a sky so bright it almost hurt my eyes. But after an hour of hiking, I started to notice this strange smell in the air, like burnt meat, but there wasn't any sign of smoke or fire. Liz smelled it too. She covered her nose and kept asking if we should turn around. Around that same time, I kept catching glimpses of something moving between the bushes. It was too fast to see properly, just a shadow or shape flitting in and out of sight. At first, I thought it might have been a coyote or some other wildlife, but each time I tried to pinpoint where it was, I'd come up empty. Tyler said maybe it was a bison moving fast in the distance, but the silhouette didn't match. I wanted to brush it off, but it left me with a cold feeling in my stomach that stuck with me the rest of the hike. We eventually made it to a good vantage point for photos and drone shots. Tyler launched his drone, and Liz and I stood off to the side, just taking in the view. The drone buzzed overhead, heading out over the canyon. Then, out of nowhere, the feed on Tyler's phone started glitching. The drone feed flickered, and for a second I saw what looked like a figure standing on a rocky ledge, staring directly at the drone camera. It was so quick, just a split second, but my heart nearly stopped. Tyler cursed under his breath because the screen went all static. A moment later, everything came back, and that spot was empty. We rushed back before the sun could fully set. By the time we reached the trailer, it was already dark, and the wind was picking up again, even stronger than the previous night. The trailer felt stuffy, and the air outside was electric, like right before a thunderstorm. We decided to just eat some quick snacks inside. None of us felt like building a fire that night. Then the knocking started, soft at first, almost like someone gently tapping. We all froze. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the trailer where the scratch marks had been. Tyler opened the door a crack to look out, but he didn't see anything. He closed it again, locked it, and that's when the tapping turned into this consistent, almost rhythmic pounding, like something was trying to get our attention on purpose. Liz started shaking and whispered that she heard voices. I told her it was probably the wind, but to be honest, I heard them too. It sounded like faint murmurs, echoing from a distance, and at times I could have sworn the voices called our names. Not clear enough to be certain, but enough to make every hair on my neck stand up. We spent hours huddled there, hearing those thumps on and off. Sometimes they would stop for a few minutes and I'd think, okay, maybe it's over. And then it would start again on the opposite side of the trailer. Every time we peeked out through the little window, all we saw was darkness. It felt like something was circling around, waiting for one of us to step outside. By the time the sky started to lighten, everything just went quiet. The wind died down, the knocking stopped, and the weird smells vanished. It was like the whole park was holding its breath. We didn't even bother making breakfast. Tyler and I grabbed our stuff, and Liz helped throw everything into the truck. We didn't fold up half our gear properly. We just shoved it in, slammed the door, and got the hell out of there. When we finally reached the main road, it was almost surreal how calm everything seemed. We drove in silence most of the way, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Tyler tried to spin it like we had a wild night in the wilderness, but he couldn't laugh it off completely. Liz said she's never going camping again, especially not in remote places. As for me, I still can't figure out what happened in those canyons. Part of me wonders if it really was just some bizarre trick of the wind and the wildlife. But deep down, I doubt that's the whole story. To this day, I keep asking myself, what was out there, stalking us through the night? What made those strange scratches on the trailer and pounded on our walls like it knew we were trapped inside? And why did it all stop so abruptly, like someone flicked a switch at dawn? I have no answers. All I know is I've never felt anything like that before or since. And whenever I hear a gust of wind outside my window, I can't help but remember those whispers, calling our names in the dark. Story 13. My name is Mark Hollis. I'm 42 years old, and in the fall of 2022, I drove my old trailer all the way from Shelbyville to the Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. I've always been fascinated by geological formations, especially sinkholes, so I thought this trip would be like any other, just me, the desert, and some photos of the bats at sunset. But there's something else out there that I can't explain, and it still keeps me up at night. I arrived in the late afternoon. The place looked a bit more restricted than I remembered from years ago. There were new fences, reinforced barriers, and warning signs telling visitors not to venture beyond certain points. I shrugged it off. I was just there to get some photos and maybe do a little exploring. By the time I parked my trailer, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. I set up my tripod near the edge of the sinkhole. The wind picked up suddenly, strong enough that I had to hold onto my gear so it wouldn't topple over. Then, as the sun was setting, a massive flock of bats emerged. I've seen bats like this before, but this time they swirled together in a shape that made me shiver. It looked almost like a face, or maybe a hand with outstretched fingers. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light. I brushed off the uneasy feeling and took some photos. That night, the wind kept howling outside my trailer, and I struggled to fall asleep. Around 3 in the morning, I jolted awake. I thought I heard something whispering my name. Mark. It was so faint I could have sworn it was just the wind, but I got up, grabbed my flashlight and looked outside. Nothing. No footprints, no animals rummaging around. Just the barren desert under the moonlight. I felt this knot in my stomach, like something was off, but I told myself I was just jumpy from being alone in such an isolated area. When dawn came, I decided to circle the sinkhole to see if there were any better vantage points for pictures. There was a stretch of ground partially eroded along the edges, so I took it slow. At one point, I stumbled on a half-buried notebook. The cover was torn, and it was caked in dry dirt. Curious, I wiped off the dust and flipped through a few pages. Inside were these weird symbols. Some looked like runes, others like drawings of grotesque figures. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. There were no obvious names or dates, but I noticed some shapes that reminded me of that swirling bat formation. I stuffed the notebook in my backpack, figuring I could examine it in the trailer later. That afternoon, I felt a growing sense of dread, like I was being watched. The wind never fully died down, and it kept rattling the sides of my trailer. By evening, I couldn't focus on my photography because I kept looking over my shoulder. Finally, I decided to head back to the trailer and lock up for the night. The minute I closed the door, the overhead lights started flickering. I checked the battery connection, thinking maybe my generator was acting up, but everything seemed fine. Then came these soft, repetitive tapping sounds against the trailer walls, like someone was walking around and lightly knocking. I tried to ignore it at first, but it got louder. I stepped outside with my flashlight. My heart was racing, and the desert felt unnaturally quiet. Then, in the distance, I saw something tall, standing near a cluster of rocks. It was hard to make out, but the eyes stood out immediately, like two dull, glowing embers staring straight at me. It was shaped roughly like a person, but there was something warped about it. Its limbs looked too long, or maybe it was just hunched. I only caught a glimpse before it moved behind the rocks. I was so terrified I nearly dropped my flashlight. I bolted back into the trailer and locked the door. My brain was screaming at me to leave, but part of me wanted to believe maybe it was just a large animal. Then I remembered the notebook. I pulled it from my backpack and started flipping through the pages under the flickering light. The symbols almost seemed to move when I looked at them. My vision blurred, and this sudden wave of nausea hit me. I can't explain it, but it felt like the air got heavier, as if something was pressing in on me. That's when I heard the whispering again, only now it was louder, clearer. It said my name twice, followed by words I couldn't understand. It sounded like another language, or maybe just gibberish. My heart pounded in my ears, and I had this panicked thought that maybe the notebook was something I should have left alone. I remembered hearing stories about cursed objects acting as conduits for dark entities. It sounded ridiculous, but at that moment, it didn't feel ridiculous at all. Without thinking, I grabbed my lighter from the kitchen drawer and flicked it on. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a couple tries to get a steady flame. Then I held the notebook over the sink and set the edge of its pages on fire. The paper ignited fast, crackling as the symbols curled into black ash. Right then, a piercing scream tore through the night. It sounded close, too close, but it didn't sound human. Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze, my eyes glued to the tiny window. The lights in the trailer flickered harder, then went completely out, leaving me with nothing but the flickering flames of the burning paper. My breath came in short gasps, and I was sure that thing outside was about to break in. But all I heard was a series of frantic scratching noises along the trailer walls, followed by dead silence. I don't know how long I stood there waiting for something else to happen. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. Eventually, I forced myself to look outside again. The wind was still blowing, but there was no sign of that creature. I walked around the trailer with my flashlight looking for footprints or tracks, but I only saw my own. It was as if whatever was there had vanished along with the shrieking. Adrenaline surged through me, and I decided I wasn't spending another second in that place. I quickly packed up my camera gear, shoved everything I could into the trailer, and got back on the road. The entire time, I had this lingering feeling that something was watching from the darkness. But nothing followed me, at least not that I could see. Once I was a safe distance away, I pulled over, trying to catch my breath and steady my nerves. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, I get chills. I keep asking myself what that notebook was and why it felt so wrong. Part of me is convinced that the sinkhole is more than just a geological formation. It's some kind of gateway or place of power, something that can draw in or manifest things we can't understand. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. To this day, I can't explain any of it. One moment it was just another desert trip, and the next I was facing something that made me question what's really out there. All I know is that I never want to experience that kind of terror again. Sometimes at night, I still wake up thinking I hear that whisper, calling my name. I hope it's just my imagination. I really do. But I can't shake the feeling that I left a part of myself out there at the devil's sinkhole, and whatever was out there, maybe it's not finished with me yet. Story 14. I still remember pulling my trailer into that small clearing by Caddo Lake. The place felt almost prehistoric, with those massive cypress trees draped in moss and the water looking so dark it could swallow anything. My name is Marcus Allen. I'm 38, and in 2021 I drove down from Hartsburg to capture some shots of this legendary spot. I had this idea that moody, mysterious lake photos could boost my wildlife photography portfolio. The moment I arrived, something in the air felt thick, like the atmosphere was heavier than normal. I brushed it off as nerves or just the unfamiliar humidity. That first afternoon, I stopped at a tiny store run by a woman named Darla. She looked at me kind of funny when I mentioned I'd be camping by the water. She brought up an old legend, something about the Witch of Caddo Lake, a healer who was drowned long ago. I just smiled, thinking it was local folklore meant to keep travelers entertained or on edge. I've heard similar ghost stories in other small towns, always an interesting bit of local color. I got back, set up my tripod near the bank, and waited for evening light. The weather was warm, but as the sun went down, everything seemed to get eerily still. When the moon rose, it cast this incredible silver glow across the lake. The water became almost like a mirror, perfect for a long exposure shot. I started snapping away, excited by the reflections. Then I heard something like a soft singing coming from the middle of the lake. It was faint, but definitely sounded like a woman's voice carrying a tune I couldn't recognize. I aimed my camera toward where I thought it was coming from, but through the lens, I only saw a patch of low fog hovering over the water. I remember the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I don't usually spook easily. I've camped in swamps, forests, you name it. But this felt different. I tried to zoom in, hoping to catch some silhouette, but nothing showed up in real time. It was just that fog. I kept hearing that distant lullaby, so I snapped a few shots just in case. When I went to review them on the camera's small screen, one shot seemed to show a faint female figure in the mist. I almost dropped the camera in surprise, but after the initial shock, I flipped back and forth, and the image looked more like a weird distortion. Could have been anything, a lens flare, a trick of the light. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, combined with some effect of the humidity. The next day, I ran into this guy named Ethan, who lived on a houseboat not far from my campsite. He was friendly at first, but the minute I told him why I was there, he got serious. He said something like, "This lake has a way of taking people who go looking too hard." He insisted I leave while I still could. The way he spoke made me uneasy. He seemed genuinely worried. But my stubborn side told me to stay. I was determined to get the shots I needed. Night came again, and this time it felt heavier, almost like the lake was waiting for me. That singing returned, except now it was way closer to my trailer. It was the same sad, melodic tune, and the sound echoed between the cypress trees. My heart started pounding, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd rented a small boat, and against all common sense, I hopped in. The water looked black under the moonlight, and the air had this sharp chill that sank into my bones. As I paddled, the fog thickened, every sound carried, water dripping off the paddle, my own breathing, and that haunting voice. I reached a spot where the trees formed a kind of natural corridor, and that's when I saw her. Something like a woman's figure just above the surface. Her hair was slick, hanging in dark strands across her face, and she seemed to be staring right at me. The strangest thing was her eyes. They looked almost hollow, not reflecting any light. My throat went dry. I tried to raise my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even line up a shot. Then she moved her lips, like she was whispering something, but the words were muffled by the sound of water lapping against the boat. All I caught was this sudden drop in temperature, like an icy wave that passed through me. It hit so hard I almost let go of the oar. I panicked and began to row back, practically spinning the boat around. I heard a splash that sounded way too close, and I swear I felt something brush against the side of the boat. My heart was racing, and I just kept rowing as fast as I could until I hit the bank near my trailer. By the time I got out, I was trembling so badly I could barely walk straight. I raced inside, locked the door, and tried to calm myself. Outside, I kept hearing soft scraping against the trailer walls, like fingers dragging across metal. But I told myself it was just branches or the wind. I spent the night jumping at every small sound, convinced that if I looked out the window, I'd see her again. I might have dozed off from exhaustion around dawn because I woke up to weak sunlight filtering through the curtains. That morning, I decided I was done. I packed everything, attached the trailer to my truck, and left without even looking back at the lake. It felt like escaping, and honestly, that's exactly what I wanted to do. Once I got somewhere safer, I started checking the photos on my camera's memory card in more detail. I almost dropped the laptop when I saw the series of images, that same distorted silhouette, but each shot showed it a little clearer. By the final few frames, you could see the outline of a face in the fog, and it looked disturbingly like the figure I'd seen on the water. There's no logical explanation for how those photos got incrementally sharper, like she was coming closer to the camera each time. I've never shared them publicly. Part of me thinks no one would believe me. The other part doesn't want to risk drawing any more attention to whatever is out there. I've been to some eerie places in my life, but nothing ever shook me like Caddo Lake. It's been a while, and I still can't fully explain what happened or how something that felt so supernatural could appear in my camera shots. It just did. And honestly, I have no desire to go back. Sometimes late at night I'll dream of that eerie singing and wake up in a cold sweat. I try to brush it off, telling myself it's just a nightmare. But deep down, I know there's something at that lake that doesn't want to be understood. Something old and angry, lingering in the swampy darkness. To this day, I can't prove what I saw or heard, but I'll never forget it. Even now, every time I look at those pictures, I feel like that presence might still be watching, and that's enough to keep me far away from Caddo Lake.